Before we start, I want to share a heartfelt thank you to those who have sent a donation to our channel. Your kindness truly keeps this little corner of ours alive. If you'd like to support our work too, you can find the link in the first comment. Blessings to you all, and let's get ready for today's story. Dr. Thackeray adjusted his wire-rimmed glasses and looked down at the great golden retriever lying motionless on the polished pine floor of the clinic, the dog's golden coat dulled as though the very light had decided to leave him. The veterinarian had practiced in Bitterroot Valley for 37 years, and he knew that look. It was the look of a creature who had simply chosen to stop. The heart still beat, the lungs still moved, but the soul had quietly slipped away through the cracks beneath the door, following the man who had loved this dog for 14 long winters. Outside the Grey Peaks Clinic, snow drifted lazily against the window panes, and a stubborn fire crackled in the stone hearth that warmed the recovery room. The clinic smelled, as it always did, of strong coffee brewed too early, faint antiseptic, and the sweet wood smoke of birch logs. It was a building made of river stone and weathered pine, perched on the edge of a valley where winter was not merely a season, but a measure of one's character. "He hasn't touched the water again, Doctor," said Zuleika, the young assistant, kneeling beside the dog. Her dark braid fell over one shoulder, and her hands, calloused from years of lifting frightened animals, rested gently on Koda's broad shoulder. "Not since Tuesday." Dr. Thackeray pressed his lips together. Silas raised him from a pup. They walked these mountains together every season for 14 years. A heart like that doesn't just forget. "He's grieving." "Yes," the old veterinarian said softly. "He is." The bell above the front door jingled, and a gust of cold air swept into the clinic, bringing with it the unmistakable presence of the man who had been making everyone's days a little heavier for the past 2 weeks. Mr. Sterling, the county health inspector, stamped the snow from his polished boots and removed his leather gloves with the deliberate slowness of a man who enjoyed making others wait. "Dr. Thackeray," he said, his voice as flat as the ledger he carried under one arm, "we need to talk about your long-term residents. The county is not in the business of funding a hospice for hopeless cases." The old vet straightened slowly, his back stiff from years of leaning over examination tables. "Mr. Sterling, this dog belonged to one of the most respected men this valley ever produced. Silas Holloway guided 3 generations of children through these woods. The least we can do is let him rest somewhere warm. Warm or not, he's occupying a kennel that could house an adoptable animal. I'll be back Friday with the transfer paperwork. He goes to the county shelter." Zuleika rose to her feet, her cheeks flushed. "Sir, that shelter is 2 hours away. It's freezing. He won't survive the journey." Sterling's pale eyes flickered toward her, unmoved. "Then that, young lady, will be one less file on my desk." He turned and left, the bell jingling once more behind him. The silence that followed felt heavier than any snowdrift outside. Zuleika sank back to her knees beside Koda. Her hand trembled as she stroked the dog's ear. She had told herself 100 times over the past month that she would quit this work. The protocols, the cold mathematics of which animals stayed and which went, the way her heart broke a little every Friday afternoon. She had a letter of resignation half written in her apron pocket. And then, from the corner of the room, came the smallest sound, a scratching, a patient, methodical scratching, as though something very small was working on a problem far larger than itself. Zuleika looked toward the cage on the lower shelf, where a tiny smoke-gray kitten with amber eyes was working the latch of his enclosure with a paw no bigger than a thimble. The kitten paused, looked directly at her with an expression of unsettling intelligence, and resumed his work. "Vesper," she whispered. "What in the world are you doing?" The kitten did not answer. He simply tilted his head toward the sleeping golden retriever, as if to say, "Have you not noticed? There is work to be done." And somewhere deep in the clinic, the old grandfather clock in the front hall struck midnight, beginning the first of 72 hours that would change everything. 3 weeks earlier, on a morning when frost still clung to the cottonwoods along Willow Creek, a forest ranger named Otis Carver had driven his rattling truck up to the Grey Peaks Clinic with a cardboard box on the passenger seat. Inside the box, wrapped in an old flannel shirt, was a kitten so small that Dr. Thackeray had at first mistaken him for a smoke-colored mouse. Found him at the old Brackenridge mill, Otis had said, removing his cap and turning it slowly in his weathered hands. The whole litter was gone. Mother too. Only this one made it. Don't know how, Doc. He'd been living off cracked corn and rainwater, near as I can tell. Dr. Thackeray had lifted the tiny creature with the gentleness of a man handling a soap bubble. The kitten weighed almost nothing, but when he opened his eyes, those amber eyes had fixed on the doctor with a steadiness that did not belong in a creature so young. "He's a fighter," Otis had said. "Watched him for 10 minutes before I picked him up. He was carrying a strip of bark to cover a hole in the wall. A kitten, Doc, doing chores. That's not possible. I know what I saw." Zuleika had named him Vesper, after the evening star that appeared above the western ridge on the night they took him in. From the very first day, the kitten was unlike any animal she had cared for. He did not play with the cotton balls she rolled across the floor. He did not pounce at the string toys. Instead, he watched. He watched everything. When an old retriever was brought in with a swollen paw, Vesper had positioned himself at the kennel door and pressed his small forehead against the bars until the dog calmed. When a young calico arrived shaking from the cold, Vesper had somehow worked the latch of his own cage, padded across the room, and curled himself against her side. The calico had stopped shaking within minutes. "He's a healer," Zuleika had whispered to Dr. Thackeray one evening as they watched the kitten through the window of the recovery room. "I don't know how else to explain it." Dr. Thackeray had only nodded. He had seen many strange things in his 37 years. A pigeon that returned every year to the same nail on his porch. A barn cat who refused to leave her dying farmer's bedside until the very last breath. The world, he had learned long ago, was full of mysteries that did not require his understanding to be true. But Vesper was different even from those. Now, on this cold December night, the kitten had finally turned his attention to the saddest case the clinic had ever held. And Zuleika, kneeling beside Koda in the warm glow of the hearth, found herself wondering if perhaps the universe had not been quite as careless as she had thought when it sent that little grey shadow up from a grain mill in the middle of nowhere. She watched as Vesper, having freed himself from his cage, padded silently across the floor. He did not approach Koda directly. Instead, he circled the great dog at a respectful distance, as though surveying a wounded mountain. Then he sat down precisely 3 feet from Koda's nose, folded his paws beneath himself, and simply waited. "What are you doing, little one?" Zuleika murmured. Vesper did not blink. He was listening to something only he could hear. And as Zuleika watched, she felt the smallest flutter of hope, like a candle relit in a long, dark room. She did not yet know what the kitten intended, but she knew, with a certainty she could not explain, that something was about to begin. Behind her, the wind shifted, rattling a loose shutter against the side of the clinic, and from somewhere in the depths of his grief, the old golden retriever opened one tired eye. Morning came pale and reluctant over Bitterroot Valley. The snow had stopped sometime before dawn, leaving the world hushed beneath a fresh white blanket that softened every angle and silenced every footstep. Inside the clinic, Dr. Thackeray brewed his second pot of coffee and stood at the window, watching a single elk move slowly through the meadow beyond the fence. Zuleika had fallen asleep in the wooden rocking chair beside Koda, an Afghan pulled up to her chin. The dog had not moved through the night, but he had drunk a single shallow lap of water at 4 in the morning. The veterinarian had marked it carefully in his ledger. It was Vesper, however, who had been busy. Sometime in the small hours before dawn, the kitten had begun a methodical exploration of the recovery room. Dr. Thackeray, watching from his chair behind the front desk, had observed the little grey shadow squeezing into spaces no creature his size had any business investigating. Beneath the supply cabinet, behind the old wood stove, into the gap between the floorboards where a long-ago pipe had been removed. "What are you hunting, mister?" the doctor had murmured, peering over his glasses. He had received no answer, of course, but around 5 in the morning, the kitten had emerged from beneath the medicine cabinet, dragging something nearly as long as himself. It was a small wooden whistle, carved from a piece of mountain ash, blackened with age and the oil of many years' handling. The lanyard was a thin strip of braided leather, worn soft. Dr. Thackeray had recognized it instantly. He had seen Silas Holloway pull that whistle from his coat pocket 100 times. 3 short blasts, and Koda would come bounding through whatever underbrush he had been investigating. The whistle must have fallen from the old guide's pocket on his last visit, slipping into the gap beneath the cabinet where no one had thought to look. The kitten had carried that whistle, foot by careful foot, all the way across the room. He had laid it down precisely beneath Koda's nose. Then he had backed away 3 steps and sat down, watching. Dr. Thackeray had risen quietly and approached. He had bent low, his old knees protesting, and gathered the whistle into his hand. He held it to his own nose and breathed in. Even after weeks beneath the cabinet, it still carried the faintest scent of pipe tobacco, pine resin, and the leather of an old wool coat. The scent of Silas. He had placed the whistle back, exactly where Vesper had set it, and he had returned to his chair. What happened next, the veterinarian would later swear to his wife Marigold over dinner, was the closest thing to a miracle he had ever witnessed in his long career. Koda's broad chest had risen, not in the shallow, defeated way it had risen for the past 2 weeks, but deeply. A long, slow, full breath. His nostrils had quivered. His ears, which had hung limp and lifeless, had twitched faintly forward. And then, very slowly, the great dog had stretched out his neck and pressed his nose against the wooden whistle. He did not lift his head. He did not stand. He simply breathed in the scent of his lost friend, again and again, with the patient devotion of a creature receiving a message from very far away. Zuleika had woken at that moment, sensing the change in the room the way a mother senses a shift in her sleeping child. She had looked at the dog. She had looked at the kitten. She had looked at Dr. Thackeray, whose old eyes were suspiciously bright behind his glasses. "What is it?" she had whispered. "He found him a piece of Silas," the doctor had said. "The cat. He found him a piece of Silas." Zuleika had risen, walked silently to where Vesper sat watching his patient, and lifted the little kitten into her arms. She had pressed her cheek to his soft grey head, and she had felt, for the first time in months, the tears flow freely. "You strange, strange little creature," she had whispered into his fur. "Where did you come from?" Vesper had only purred, his eyes fixed on the old dog who was, very slowly, beginning to remember that he had loved someone. But Friday was still 3 days away, and Mr. Sterling's paperwork was already waiting on his desk, written in the cold black ink of a man who had not yet learned what a kitten could do. By the second morning, the news had begun to spread quietly through Bitterroot Valley, in the way that small-town news always travels. The postmistress mentioned it to the woman who ran the bakery. The bakery woman mentioned it to the farrier. The farrier mentioned it to his wife over breakfast, and his wife, who taught Sunday school, mentioned it to half the congregation by noon. There was a kitten at the Grey Peaks Clinic, they said, who had decided to save Silas Holloway's dog. Dr. Thackeray's telephone began to ring, with concerned questions, well wishes, and the occasional offer of homemade biscuits. Marigold, the doctor's wife, drove down from their cabin with a basket of cornbread and a jar of elderberry preserves, and refused to leave until she had seen the dog with her own eyes. She stood in the doorway of the recovery room, a stout woman in a knitted cardigan the color of cranberries, and shook her head slowly. "That dog used to chase my chickens every spring," she said softly. "Silas would come bring me eggs as an apology. I haven't seen Koda look so still since the day he was born." But on this second morning, Koda was not entirely still anymore. Vesper had been at his work since sunrise. The little kitten, with the unhurried determination of a craftsman who knows his trade, had begun to address the dog's physical decline. He had climbed, paw over paw, onto Koda's broad shoulder, and he had begun to nibble very gently at the tip of one floppy ear. Koda had grumbled, a deep, weary rumble from somewhere in his chest. But he had not pulled away. Encouraged, Vesper had moved to the back of the neck, where the old dog's joints were stiffest. The kitten had pressed his small paws into the muscle, kneading the way kittens have kneaded their mothers since the beginning of cats, working slowly and methodically. He had done this for nearly an hour, his amber eyes half closed in concentration, his tiny throat producing the steady rumble of a purr that seemed far too loud for a body so small. Zuleika had watched it all from her chair, hardly daring to breathe. Dr. Thackeray had come in twice, paused in the doorway, and silently returned to his desk. Around noon, the trouble had come. Koda, in a moment of confused half-sleep, had jerked his great head upward. His broad paw, easily larger than the entire kitten, had swung outward in a clumsy, defensive arc. It had caught Vesper across the side and sent the little creature tumbling across the wood floor. Zuleika had cried out and rushed forward, but Vesper, righting himself with the wounded dignity of a small gentleman, had simply shaken his head, given the floor a disgruntled look, and walked straight back to the dog. What happened next, Zuleika would later describe to anyone who would listen, was the moment she knew she would not be quitting her job. The kitten did not climb back onto Koda's shoulder. He walked, with great deliberation, to the front of the dog's face. He sat down. He looked into Koda's tired brown eyes for what seemed like a very long time. And then, slowly, he leaned forward and pressed his small grey forehead directly against the dog's broad muzzle. Forehead to forehead, the smallest creature in the room anchoring the largest. Koda's body, which had been trembling faintly for 2 weeks, went still. His breathing slowed. A single tear, the kind that old dogs sometimes produce when no one is looking, rolled down the fur beneath his eye and onto the wooden floor. And the kitten simply held his position like a tiny lighthouse against the dark. "He's anchoring him," Zuleika whispered, "like a rope thrown to a drowning man." Dr. Thackeray, who had come quietly back into the room, only nodded. He had no scientific explanation. He had only what he had seen. It was several hours later that Zuleika discovered the cost of all this work. Vesper, in his single-minded devotion to his patient, had not eaten all day. He had not drunk water. He had not slept. When Zuleika finally lifted him to take him to his food bowl, she felt with alarm how light he had become, how his ribs pressed against her palm like the bones of a small bird. She had set him gently before his dish of warm broth. The kitten had bent his head to drink. And then, in a moment that broke Zuleika's heart and made her laugh through her tears in the very same breath, the exhausted little creature had simply tipped forward and toppled head-first into his own water bowl. He sat there, half submerged, blinking up at her with an expression of mild surprise. "Oh, you foolish, brave little thing," she whispered, lifting him out and wrapping him in a soft towel. "You can't pour from an empty pitcher." She dried him carefully, fed him by hand, and tucked him into the crook of Koda's great paw. The old dog, for the first time in weeks, curled his leg inward, drawing the kitten close. And outside, the wind began to rise. The weather radio on Dr. Thackeray's desk crackled, and a serious voice announced that a heavy snowstorm was moving down from the Canadian Rockies. It would arrive by nightfall. The kind of storm, the voice said, that could knock out power for days. "Before we continue, I want to take a moment to talk to you. YouTube has decided that our channel does not meet their requirements to be supported by their platform. We believe this is a mistake, and we are fighting it. But right now, the only thing keeping Paws and Whispers alive is the love you have for these stories. If our videos have ever touched your heart, consider making a small donation. Even $1 helps us keep going. Just being here, watching and caring, already means the world to us. The donation link is pinned in the comments below. Thank you. By late afternoon of the third day, the sky over Bitterroot Valley had turned the color of old pewter, and the wind had begun to speak in the low, urgent voice it used only when serious weather was on its way. Dr. Thackeray walked the perimeter of the clinic with his old retriever mix Hank at his heels, checking the storm shutters, the woodpile, and the backup generator that he prayed would not be needed. Marigold had driven home before the roads closed, but not before pressing 2 thermoses of hot beef stew into Zuleika's hands. "You'll need this tonight, dear," she had said. "And don't you let that horrible Sterling man bully you. You hear me?" Sterling, however, had not gone home. The county inspector had arrived just before 3 in the afternoon, his ledger under his arm, his pale eyes fixed on a future he had already decided upon. He had announced that he would be staying through the night in the small visitors' room above the clinic, the better to oversee the transfer of animals in the morning. He had said it as if daring anyone to object. Dr. Thackeray had not objected. He had only nodded, set out a fresh pot of coffee, and quietly placed an extra wool blanket on the bed in the visitors' room. "Why is he staying?" Zuleika had whispered fiercely. "Why doesn't he just go home?" "Because he wants to be the first one here when the morning comes," the doctor had replied, his voice low. "He wants to make sure no one changes their mind." The storm hit at 6:30. It began, as such storms always begin in Montana, with a sudden hush. The wind that had been speaking grew silent, as though gathering its breath. The snow, which had been falling lightly all afternoon, paused. The whole valley seemed to draw in its shoulders, and then, with a sound like a freight train made of wind, it came roaring down from the mountains. The lights in the clinic flickered once, twice, and then went out altogether. For a long moment, there was only darkness and the howl of the storm against the windows. Then Dr. Thackeray's voice, calm as a winter lake. "Zuleika, the lanterns are in the cabinet by the back door. The matches are on the shelf above. Mr. Sterling, if you'd care to make yourself useful, the generator is in the shed. The pull cord can be stubborn in the cold." Sterling, who had been writing in his ledger by the front window, looked up as if he had been personally insulted by the weather. But after a long pause, he had stood, pulled on his coat, and gone out into the storm. Zuleika moved swiftly. She lit 3 kerosene lanterns and placed them strategically around the recovery room. The soft yellow light bloomed against the wooden walls, throwing long shadows that danced like memories. The fire in the hearth was banked low but still alive, and she fed it carefully with the dry birch logs Dr. Thackeray had split that summer. The clinic, without the steady hum of its electric heaters, began almost at once to cool. Zuleika knelt beside Koda. The old dog had been doing better, sitting up briefly that afternoon, even managing a few licks of broth from her cupped hand. But now, in the dropping temperature, his breathing had grown shallow again. His thick golden coat, which should have been his protection, hung loose around a body that had grown thin from weeks of refusing food. "His core temperature is dropping," she said urgently when Dr. Thackeray came in with another lantern. "We need more blankets." They piled every blanket they could find around the old dog. Zuleika rubbed his paws to keep the circulation moving. Dr. Thackeray brewed a thin, warm broth on the camp stove and dribbled it into the side of Koda's mouth, drop by patient drop. But the cold was relentless, and Sterling, returning from the shed with his coat dusted in snow, brought bad news. "Generators frozen solid," he said, stamping his boots. "Won't turn over. We won't have power until that thing thaws or the lines come back, whichever comes first." He had said it flatly, but there was something in his voice that was not quite the same as it had been that morning. Something almost like discomfort. He stood in the doorway of the recovery room and watched the old veterinarian and the young assistant working over the failing dog. His ledger, for the first time all day, was nowhere in his hands. Vesper, meanwhile, had been very quiet. The little kitten had been curled in the bend of Koda's foreleg, watching, listening, calculating. And now, as the temperature in the room continued to fall and the old dog's shivering grew more pronounced, Vesper rose. He stretched once, the way cats stretch when they have decided what must be done. He looked up at Zuleika with those amber eyes, and Zuleika would later swear that he gave her a small nod, as if to say, "I have this." Then he climbed, paw over paw, up the great golden flank of the retriever. The tiny kitten ascended like a mountaineer scaling a sleeping mountain. He reached the broad chest. He paused, and then, with the same unhurried deliberation he had brought to every task of the past 3 days, he settled himself directly over Koda's heart. He spread his small body out as flat as he could make it, his belly pressed to the dog's chest, his head tucked beneath the dog's chin. He began to purr. It was not an ordinary purr. Dr. Thackeray, who had read in veterinary journals about the healing frequencies of feline vocalization, would later say that it was the deepest, most sustained purr he had ever heard from a cat, a purr that seemed to vibrate not just through the kitten's small frame, but through the entire chest of the dog beneath him. A purr that said very clearly, "I am here. You are not alone. We will warm each other." And in the wavering light of the kerosene lanterns, with the storm howling at the windows, a strange and beautiful thing began to happen. The kerosene lanterns burned steady and gold. The wind outside the clinic threw itself against the shutters again and again, like a child demanding to be let in. Inside the recovery room, Zuleika held a wool blanket up to the firelight, checking it for tears, while Dr. Thackeray brewed another small pot of broth over the camp stove. And on the floor, in the soft circle of light, the impossible was unfolding. Koda's shivering had slowed. His breathing, which had been shallow and uneven, was deepening. The kitten on his chest had not moved for nearly an hour, his tiny body acting as a living heating pad, his steady purr a kind of song that seemed to coax the dog's failing systems back into rhythm. Zuleika checked the dog's gum color with her flashlight. It was pinker than it had been an hour ago. His paws, which had been alarmingly cool, had warmed slightly. She could hardly believe what she was seeing. "He's stabilizing," she whispered. "Doctor, he's actually stabilizing." Dr. Thackeray came over and knelt down with great difficulty. His old joints popped audibly, but he did not seem to notice. He laid his weathered hand on Koda's flank and felt the slow, steady rise and fall. "That cat," the doctor said softly, "is doing something I cannot put in any chart." Behind them, in the doorway, Mr. Sterling stood watching. He had been standing there for some time, long enough that the snow in his hair had melted, long enough that the cold draft from the hallway had stopped bothering him. His ledger was tucked under one arm, but he had not opened it. His face, usually so carefully composed, had loosened into something almost like wonder. He cleared his throat. "How long has he been doing that?" Zuleika turned, startled to find him so close. "The kitten?" "Almost an hour now. He hasn't moved." "And the dog?" "His temperature is coming back. His breathing is steadier. I think the kitten might be saving his life." Sterling stepped forward slowly. He stopped a few feet from where the dog and kitten lay, and he looked down at them for a long, long moment. The lantern light caught the grey in his hair and softened the sharp lines of his face. He looked suddenly less like an inspector and more like a tired man who had been carrying something heavy for a very long time. "My wife," he said quietly after a while. He did not look up. "My wife had a dog. After our daughter passed." Zuleika went very still. Dr. Thackeray did not turn around, but his hand on Koda's flank grew very gentle. It was a little brown terrier mix. Nothing special to look at. "We got him from a shelter in Helena. My wife she was not doing well. She would not get out of bed some mornings. And this dog, this scruffy little thing, he would not leave her side. He would lie on her chest, exactly like that little cat is doing now, and he would not move. For hours." Sterling paused. He swallowed. "My wife told me near the end that the dog had kept her here, long after she had wanted to leave. She said he had been a tether. That was the word she used. A tether." The fire crackled in the hearth. Outside, the wind began for the first time in hours to ease. "What happened to him?" Zuleika asked softly. "The little dog." "He went 6 weeks after her," Sterling said. "Wouldn't eat, wouldn't drink. We tried everything. He just followed her." He shook his head slowly, as if shaking off a long sleep. "I told myself after that I would not let this kind of attachment cloud my judgment anymore. That animals were animals. That a kennel was a kennel. That the work had to be done coldly, or it could not be done at all." He looked down at Koda, at the little grey kitten curled on the dog's broad chest, at the slow, peaceful rise and fall of two creatures who had, between them, decided not to give up. "I have been wrong," he said. His voice was very low. "I have been wrong about a great many things." He stood there for another moment. Then he reached into the inside pocket of his coat and drew out a folded sheet of paper, thick and official, with the county seal embossed at the top. The transfer order. He held it in his hands as though weighing it, and then, very slowly, very deliberately, Mr. Sterling tore the paper down the middle. He tore it again, and again. He let the pieces fall into the small enamel waste bin beside the wood stove, where they fluttered down like tired snow. "I'll tell my supervisor I was unable to complete the transfer due to weather," he said. "By Monday, the dog will have improved enough that the case will be closed. And as for the cat," he looked at Vesper, who had opened one amber eye to regard him with mild curiosity. "As for the cat, I would suggest that your clinic find him a very permanent position. Whatever it is he is doing, he should be allowed to keep doing it." Zuleika could not speak. Her throat had closed entirely. Dr. Thackeray rose, slowly, with a creak of old knees and a small smile that had been a long time in coming. "Mr. Sterling," he said, "would you care for a cup of coffee? The pot is fresh." The inspector looked at him for a moment, and then, for the first time since anyone in Bitterroot Valley had ever met him, he smiled. It was a small, tired, surprised smile, like a man who had just remembered how the muscles worked. "Yes," he said. Yes, I believe I would. And outside, the wind died away to nothing, and the snow began to fall again, gentle and forgiving, blanketing the valley in a white that promised, for the first time in a long time, only quiet. The power returned at 4:30 the next morning, with a small electric hum that seemed almost shy after the long silence of the storm. Zuleika, who had fallen asleep in the rocking chair with her head against the wall, woke to the soft yellow glow of the overhead lights and the smell of fresh coffee. Dr. Thackeray was already up, of course. He had been up since well before dawn, the way he always was. She rose stiffly and crossed to where Koda lay. The old golden retriever was sleeping deeply, his great head resting on his paws. The kitten was no longer on his chest. Vesper had moved at some point in the night to a small basket beside the dog's head, where he was curled into a perfect grey spiral, his nose tucked beneath his tail. But there was something different about Koda this morning. Something Zuleika could not at first name. She knelt down and looked at him carefully. His coat, that was it. His coat had its shine back. Not entirely, not yet, but the dull grey cast of the past 2 weeks had lifted. The deep gold was returning, like sunlight returning to a meadow at the end of a long rain. She put her hand gently on his shoulder. Koda's eyes opened. They focused on her, clear and present, in a way they had not focused on anything since the day Silas had been laid to rest in the small cemetery up the hill. "Good morning, old friend," Zuleika whispered. Koda's tail moved, just once, just a small, slow thump against the wooden floor. But Zuleika heard it as clearly as a church bell. "Doctor!" she called, her voice cracking. "Doctor, come quickly." Dr. Thackeray hurried in from the kitchen, his coffee mug in his hand. He saw Zuleika's face. He saw Koda's eyes. He saw the tail, which had now thumped a second time. "Well now," he said softly. "Well now." The recovery, when it came, was not swift. Old grief does not lift like morning fog. It lifts in stages, like the slow thaw of a Montana spring. But it did lift. By the end of the first week after the storm, Koda was eating again. Not much at first. A small bowl of warm chicken and rice in the morning, and another in the evening. Vesper, who had appointed himself the chief supervisor of all matters relating to Koda's well-being, would sit beside the dish and watch every bite with the seriousness of a small grey accountant. By the end of the second week, Koda was standing. The first time he rose to his feet on his own, it was because Vesper had walked very deliberately to the door of the recovery room and begun to scratch at it, as if announcing that it was high time the patient took some air. Koda, watching from his blanket, had heaved himself slowly upright on legs that trembled with disuse and had taken 3 shaking steps before lying back down. But 3 steps on that day was a victory worth a feast. Dr. Thackeray had marked it in his ledger with hands that were not quite steady. The story of what had happened in the clinic during the great storm spread through Bitterroot Valley in the way that good stories always spread in small towns. The bakery woman told her customers. The postmistress told the mail carriers. The Sunday school teacher told her students, who told their grandmothers, who told everyone else. People began to drop by the clinic. They brought small gifts, a knitted blanket for Koda, a tin of homemade salmon treats for Vesper, a jar of honey for Dr. Thackeray. The clinic, which had for so long been a place where the people of the valley brought their hardest sorrows, became, slowly, something else as well. A place where they brought their hopes. And one morning, 3 weeks after the storm, a young woman with a camera around her neck and a kind, tired face walked through the front door. "My name is Marisol," she said. "I'm a photographer with a small magazine out of Missoula. I heard there was a kitten and an old dog here. I wondered if you would let me tell their story." Zuleika looked at Dr. Thackeray. Dr. Thackeray looked at Koda, who was lying in his patch of sunlight by the window, with Vesper draped contentedly across his back like a small smoke-grey scarf. "I think," the old doctor said slowly, "that they would not mind being photographed, so long as you bring some salmon treats." Marisol smiled. From her camera bag, she produced a small tin. "I came prepared." She spent the afternoon at the clinic. She photographed Koda's slow, careful walk across the recovery room, with Vesper hopping along beside him like a small, encouraging coach. She photographed the moment when the dog lay down in his patch of sun and the kitten climbed onto his back and yawned wide enough to show every tiny white tooth. She photographed Dr. Thackeray refilling the water bowl and Zuleika sitting on the floor with her head against Koda's shoulder and Mr. Sterling, who had taken to dropping by on Saturday mornings, kneeling stiffly to scratch the kitten behind the ears. Before she left, Marisol turned at the doorway. "This story is going to travel," she said quietly. "I hope you're ready for that." Zuleika smiled. "I think Koda and Vesper can handle anything by now." But neither she nor Dr. Thackeray could have guessed how far the story would travel, or whom, in a small reserve in the far reaches of Alaska, those photographs would find. Spring came late to Bitterroot Valley that year, as it always did. The snow held on stubbornly through March, and the streams ran high and brown when the thaw finally came. But by the first week of April, the cottonwoods along Willow Creek had begun to show their soft new green, and the meadowlarks had returned to the fence posts along the county road. Koda was walking now, slowly, with the careful dignity of an old gentleman taking his constitutional, but walking. Every morning at 10 o'clock, regardless of weather, he and Vesper made their tour of the clinic grounds. Koda would shuffle along the gravel path with the patient gait of an elder. Vesper would dart ahead, double back, leap onto a fence post, leap off, and finally settle himself onto Koda's broad back for the ride home. It had become, by mid-April, one of the most photographed sights in Montana. Marisol's article had appeared in the magazine in early February. From there, somehow, it had traveled. A larger magazine had picked it up, then a regional newspaper, then a national one. Letters began to arrive at the Grey Peaks Clinic from every state in the country, and several from beyond. Children sent drawings of dogs and cats. Old women sent embroidered handkerchiefs. A schoolteacher in Vermont sent a poem. Dr. Thackeray kept every letter in a wooden box on his desk. He read them slowly, one a day, with his afternoon coffee. And then, on a soft April morning, when the daffodils Marigold had planted along the front walk were just beginning to bloom, a small green pickup truck rolled up the gravel drive. It bore Alaska plates, dusty from the long road. A young woman climbed out, tall and slim, with long dark hair tied back in a simple braid, and eyes the same deep brown as the soil along Willow Creek. She stood for a long moment, looking at the clinic. Then she walked up the front steps and knocked. Zuleika opened the door. "My name is Elowen Holloway," the young woman said. Her voice was soft but very steady. "Silas Holloway was my grandfather. I came as soon as I saw the pictures." Zuleika's hand flew to her mouth. "Please," she said. "Please come in." They sat in the front parlor, which doubled as the clinic's waiting room. Dr. Thackeray brought out his good china cups, the ones Marigold had inherited from her own grandmother, and Zuleika brewed a fresh pot of tea. Koda was sleeping in his sun patch by the window. Vesper, who had been investigating a moth on the ceiling, paused at the appearance of the visitor and came down to inspect. He padded directly across the parlor floor, climbed into Elowen's lap, and looked up at her with those amber eyes. Elowen burst into tears. She cried for a long time, with her face pressed into the kitten's soft grey fur. Zuleika sat beside her and put an arm around her shoulders. Dr. Thackeray, who had never been good at the moments when people needed to cry, busied himself with the teapot and pretended very hard that he did not need to wipe his own eyes. When at last she could speak, Elowen lifted her head. "I should have come sooner," she said. "When I heard he had passed, I was in the middle of a research season. I told myself I would come in the spring. I told myself Koda would be all right. I should have come." "You are here now," Dr. Thackeray said gently. "That is what matters." Elowen nodded slowly. She looked across the room at Koda, who had woken at the sound of her voice and was watching her with a strange expression. The old dog struggled to his feet. He came across the parlor floor with slow, careful steps, his eyes fixed on the young woman. He stopped in front of her. He sniffed her hand. He sniffed her braid. He pressed his great golden head against her knee. "He remembers me," Elowen whispered. "He remembers me. I used to spend summers here when I was a girl. I used to throw the ball for him by the creek." She buried her hands in his fur and wept again, this time with something like joy. It was a long time later, when the tea had been finished and the second pot brewed and finished as well, that Elowen reached into her bag. She drew out a small wooden case, the kind that might have held an old set of pencils or a sewing kit. The wood was dark with age, and the brass clasp was tarnished green. "I want to show you something," she said. "My grandfather kept this. He gave it to me on my 16th birthday. She opened the case. Inside, nested in faded blue velvet, was a set of 5 wooden whistles. 4 of them lay in their proper indentations. The 5th indentation was empty. Dr. Thackeray's coffee cup paused halfway to his lips. Zuleika drew in a sharp breath. "My grandfather used these to train Koda," Elowen said quietly. "He used to say that a good guide dog had to know how to take care of the small things, the smaller animals, the lost ones. He spent years teaching Koda, 3 short blasts to come, 2 long ones to stay, a single short one for danger. And this one," she pointed to the empty space, "this one was the protection call, the one he used when he wanted Koda to watch over something small and weak. He always carried it in his coat pocket. After he passed, I assumed it had been lost somewhere on the mountain." Zuleika rose silently. She crossed to Dr. Thackeray's desk, opened the small velvet pouch in his top drawer, and brought back what was inside. She placed it gently in Elowen's hand. The young woman stared at the small wooden whistle. The mountain ash, the braided leather lanyard, worn soft. "This was found here," Zuleika said softly, "under the medicine cabinet. The kitten dragged it out and brought it to Koda. That was the first thing that brought him back." Elowen closed her hand around the whistle. She closed her eyes. "He trained Koda to protect the small ones," she whispered, "all his life. And in the end," she opened her eyes and looked down at Vesper, still curled in her lap. "In the end, it was the small one who came to protect him." The old grandfather clock in the front hall ticked softly. Outside, a meadowlark called from the fence post. And in the warm spring sunlight, in the parlor of the Grey Peaks Clinic, 4 people and 2 animals sat together in the quiet, perfect understanding that some stories are written long before we know we are reading them. Elowen stayed in Bitterroot Valley for 2 weeks. She slept in the old cabin at the foot of Silver Bluff, where her grandfather had lived for 53 years. She walked the trails he had walked. She visited his grave on the small hill behind the clinic and left a sprig of mountain sage upon the stone. And every day she came to the clinic to spend time with Koda and Vesper. She had not yet asked the question that was hanging in the air, but everyone knew it was coming. Zuleika could see it in the way Elowen looked at the old dog and the small grey kitten. Dr. Thackeray could see it in the way she lingered at the door each evening. Even Mr. Sterling, who had taken to bringing fresh trout from his weekend fishing trips, could see it. She asked it on the last day of her 2nd week, sitting on the front steps of the clinic with Vesper purring in her lap and Koda lying contentedly across her feet. "Doctor," she said, "would you let me take them home?" Dr. Thackeray looked at her over his glasses. He had been expecting the question for days. He had even rehearsed his answer. But when the moment came, he found he did not need the rehearsal. "My dear," he said, "I believe they have been waiting for you to ask." Elowen wept, but it was the good kind of weeping, the kind that comes when something broken has finally been mended. Zuleika brought out a handkerchief. Vesper, mildly offended by the disturbance to his nap, gave Elowen's chin a small, reassuring nudge with the top of his head. The next morning, a small caravan formed in the gravel drive of the Grey Peaks Clinic. Marigold had baked 4 loaves of zucchini bread for the journey. Mr. Sterling had stopped by with a brand new dog blanket, the kind made of thick fleece, which he laid carefully in the back seat of Elowen's truck. Zuleika had packed Koda's favorite bowl, his rope toy, his 3 remaining bottles of his joint supplement, and a small jar of the elderberry preserves that he liked, spread on his evening biscuit. Vesper's traveling crate had been lined with the soft towel he had slept on for the past 4 months. When everything was loaded, when every last detail had been seen to, Dr. Thackeray and Zuleika walked Elowen to the truck. Koda was lifted gently into the back seat by Mr. Sterling and Dr. Thackeray working together. The old dog settled onto his blanket with a contented sigh. Vesper hopped up beside him without needing any help at all and immediately stationed himself between Koda's front paws. Elowen turned to Zuleika first. "You saved them," she said. "No," Zuleika replied softly. "They saved each other. We were only fortunate enough to be in the room." She turned to Dr. Thackeray. She did not say anything at first. She simply took both his weathered old hands in hers and squeezed them. "Take them home, my dear," the old doctor said. "Your grandfather would be very proud." Elowen climbed into the truck. She started the engine. She rolled down the window. And as the green pickup rolled slowly down the gravel drive and turned onto the county road, Zuleika could see Koda's broad golden head silhouetted in the back window, and beside it, the small dark shape of a kitten sitting straight and proud on the dog's shoulder, looking back at the clinic where his work had been done. Alowan took them home to the high meadow beyond Silver Bluff, to the old log cabin where Silas Holloway had spent 53 years guiding children through the mountains. She opened the windows to let the spring air in. She put Koda's blanket by the wood stove. She put Vesper's bowl by the kitchen door. And on the very first morning, she watched from the back porch as Koda walked, slowly but surely, out into the green field behind the cabin. The grass was tall and soft with new growth. Wildflowers had begun to open along the fence line, lupine and Indian paintbrush, and the first pale wild roses. A meadowlark called from the cottonwood by the creek. The mountains rose blue and quiet in the distance. Koda walked to the center of the field. He stopped. He lifted his great golden head and breathed in the air. He looked for a long moment toward the high pasture where Silas had once kept his ponies. And then, from the back porch, came a small, chirping mew. Vesper bounded down the steps. He raced across the grass on his small, smoke-gray paws, leaping over the wildflowers, his tail held high. He reached Koda and stopped. He looked up at the old dog. The old dog looked down at the small cat. Then Vesper jumped, neat as a stitch, onto Koda's broad back. He sat there, proud and contented, like a tiny captain at the helm of a great golden ship. And the old dog walked slowly on through the green field, carrying the small one who had carried him. Alowan watched them from the porch, with tears on her cheeks and a smile she did not try to hide. She thought of her grandfather, of all the years he had spent teaching a young dog to look after the small things. She thought of how patiently he had trained that lesson into Koda's bones. And she thought of how, in the end, the lesson had come back the other way. The protected one had become the protector. The smallest creature in the room had carried the largest. She thought of Zuleika, who had nearly given up on her work and now ran the clinic's new therapy program for grieving animals. She thought of Dr. Thackeray, who had begun training other young veterinarians in what he now called the Vesper method. She thought of Mr. Sterling, who had taken early retirement from the county and was learning slowly how to laugh again. She thought of how many people, over the past months, had told her that the story of Koda and Vesper had changed something in them, had reminded them that grief, however heavy, is not the end, that the smallest acts of love, repeated patiently over hours and days, can pull a soul back from a very long way, that nothing alive, no matter how worn or weary, is beyond the reach of a kind heart. Out in the field, Koda lay down in a patch of sun. Vesper climbed off his back and curled against the great golden flank. The old dog rested his head on his paws. The little kitten began to purr, and the wind moved gently through the tall grass, carrying with it the scent of wild roses and warm earth, and somewhere far away, perhaps, the faint echo of a wooden whistle from a coat pocket that had once belonged to a kind old man. The end, as Silas Holloway used to say to the children he guided through the mountains, is only ever the place where another beginning takes its first breath. And in the green field behind the cabin, two old friends rested together in the sunlight, and the morning was very, very quiet and very, very good.